Good morning, everyone. It's Tara.
Hey, Jared.
And we just want to welcome you into this time of worship. I wanted to just remind everyone and just share a little bit about where we are at and where we're headed. So with worship, we are rediscovering what worship looks like, right? And ways that we can individually and as a community of faith grow deeper in worshiping. And so last week and the week before, we explored Visio Divina, or Holy Seeing, or 2 weeks ago. Last week we explored celebration, and we are going to continue that this morning. And then for the next 2 weeks, we are going to be doing music and exploring worship in that way, which we are familiar with.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to remind everyone that after each Sunday experience, there will be a prompt that we will share on Facebook and in the email. And I want to invite you and encourage you just to explore those within Missio communities, but also on your own, in your families, and just with friends, just, really sharing what your experience is like with that, because we are all different, and I think we can learn from one another in that process. So this week, celebration.
Yeah, and I feel like celebration is one of those hard ones right now, because as I've been hearing from a lot of people, it just feels like it's hard to celebrate, and we don't even necessarily know what to celebrate. I don't know, I certainly have felt some of that as kind of the weight of everything in the world, a lot of the challenges that we face right now. It feels really hard to get excited about things, to celebrate them. And so just kind of with that question in mind, how can we celebrate as a form of worship when it does feel really challenging to be excited about things right now? I don't know.
That's a good question. Well, I think part of that in celebration is kind of redefining and relooking at what celebration is. So I think there are moments of celebration that are about joy and excitement.
Right.
But I think with that word, when we think about celebration, it can look different, right? It can look different for different seasons that we're in, or different challenges that we're facing. And one of the things is that with celebration, it's about keeping company with Jesus no matter what happens.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think when we look at it that way, of more connecting to the Lord, connecting to Jesus through whatever circumstances we're going through, that is a lot more inviting, or I think a more realistic way to experience celebration.
For sure.
So, because I myself have been struggling with that too, as I was learning about it, and just some of what I shared last week of just feeling like this tension of this time and the struggles that we're facing. So I think it's that, and then also that we can rejoice in God who rejoices over us. So that in that relationship, that as He rejoices in who we are, we can rejoice over Him. And so I think it's in that knowing Him and in growing closer to Him in this time. But when we do think about identifying the things that bring us joy and pursuing those, one of the things I wanted us to think about for this week, and that I want to encourage everyone, is to think about who in your life, who brings you joy, right? Because we are meant to be in relationship. We are meant to be connecting. And maybe that looks different right now in how we're connecting, and that's something we are struggling with. But I think that I want to invite everyone to think about who is someone that brings you joy. And this week I want to invite you to reach out to them and to think about who gives you joy and ask God how you could celebrate them in a way that encourages them, right? And so that also is about knowing them, knowing what could encourage them. So I guess when I was thinking about some examples of ways that you could encourage them, you could, or reach out, simply reaching out and texting someone who comes to your mind, that they are someone who is an encouragement in your life and brings you joy. That right there could be an encouragement to someone. You know, checking in and seeing how they're doing, how they're doing, how you could be praying for them, maybe inviting them over for a meal or getting together. Also, if you can't actually get together at that time, sometimes I'll Venmo a friend for a coffee, and that could be a way to encourage someone during their day. So I just want us to think about who is someone, or it could be a couple people that come to mind that bring you joy, and reach out to them this week, and in whatever way that comes to mind, and ask God, how you could encourage them. And that could also even be asking them, hey, what is what would be encouraging to you, and for us to think about that ourselves, because you could just ask that too. So that's what I want to encourage everyone with this week, is to think about that and to reach out and connect. So
that's awesome. Well, thank you, and now we're going to hand it over to Daniel.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. We're excited to continue our study of the story of stories. And so we've taken a little bit of a step back in time to look at some of the prophets that we missed going through the first time. And so this week we're going to be talking about the prophet Micah. And he's another one of the 8th century prophets like Amos and Jonah, who we'll look at next week. And he's very similar to a lot of the things that we looked at last week about Amos, talking about injustice, idolatry that's going on in the nation of Israel, and all of these prophets calling the nation back to God and back to loving the people around them and creating a just world. This week, I really wanted to focus on a passage in Micah that sets up this vision of peace that God creates. I think this vision of peace from Micah is really important for us to look at. I know a lot of us feel the divisiveness of the day, the world that we live in, our nation, the political divide. I don't know if you're aware of this. There's an election coming up in the next couple of weeks. Just a lot of tension in our nation, particularly with all the things that have happened through COVID, George Floyd's death and the protests, all the things that have been going on in our world. Even internationally, we see things escalating between the United States and, say, China or Russia and other nations. There can be a deep fear that a lot of us feel, both nationally and internationally. Think about other things, like this month is Intimate Partner Violence Awareness Month. And thinking about the millions of people just in our nation who have experienced intimate partner violence. And I think that's why I really wanted to focus on this vision of peace that Micah sets out. And I think it's going to be really insightful for how do we as people of faith seek out peace? How do we go about that and in creating peace in our world? And just restoring this vision of peace, of justice, and nonviolence. Because I think when I think about this story of all stories, one of the things that we see throughout it is that God is not just trying to save us from these personal, individualistic sins. We're caught up in this story that's so much bigger than that. It's a story of a restoration of peace throughout our world, a truly global, perhaps even cosmic peace that restores our relationship with God, with all of us, national peace, and also peace with the very creation itself. So if you have a Bible today, we're going to be looking at Micah 4, verses 1 through 5. And so this is the vision of peace that Micah sets out. He starts off, this is verse 1, "It shall come to pass in the latter days." And so just to start off, to kind of explain this first sentence, is this idea of the latter days is actually connected to the coming Messiah. And so if you look at a text like Acts 2, there's this moment where Peter, he reflects and is preaching about this text in Joel that starts off in the exact same way, that the prophecy was happening in the latter days. And Peter says, this is being fulfilled right now. And so as we're looking at this text, it might be easy to look at the rest of it and maybe think, well, this is something that's set off into the future. And in some ways that's true, and that this vision of peace hasn't been completely fulfilled in the moment, but that there's also this truth that it began in the latter days. It began with Jesus coming into the world, and now it's our job to, with Jesus, create this picture of peace. So when he starts off in the latter days, it's this thing that began with Jesus and the coming kingdom of God, and that we participate in today. And so it's not just this future vision of what will be when Jesus returns again, but it's also this picture of what we together are trying to create in the world today, and what our call is as people of faith is. And so Micah continues. He says, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and the people shall flow to it. And many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. I really love this, that section right there, because it kind of is written like a mountain in some ways, where you begin with this vision of all the peoples of the world coming up to this mountain. And they say, come, let us come up to the mountain and the house of the God of Jacob, and he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. And then you see the coming down, where out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So you have the people going up the mountain to meet with God, and God teaches them his ways, and then his word and his law leaves the mountain and goes out to all of the other places. And I think there's a lot of connections that we could draw, but one of them is, I think this is a similar image to what Jesus says when he says, you are a city on a hill, a light that can't be hidden. It's and this vast tradition throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament of going up to mountains, going up to high places, and that's where God meets his people. And so the people are called into God's presence, called into knowing him, learning from him, and then sent back out into the world in peace, to go and create peace. And so it goes on in verse 3. He says, and God shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide for strong nations far, far away, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But they shall each sit, each man under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. And so, then you have that mountain picture and the sending out, and then you have this picture of God, the King, the Judge. If you were here 2 weeks ago, we're back at it. God is the Judge. God is judging the nations in a good way. He's the arbiter, right? If there's no judge, there can't be justice. Things just continue to escalate and escalate and escalate. But God judges with the nations. He arbitrates between the nations. And because of that, because of God's judging between peoples, because of the peoples learning his ways and being sent out with his law and his word, people begin to give up warfare. They begin to give up violence in any sense, whether it's, in this case, thinking nationally, but also, like we mentioned earlier, with intimate partner violence, even this interpersonal level is given up. And so you see, I love this image of where they take the swords and they beat them into plowshares. So you're taking something that was created with the intent to take life, and you change it into something that is meant to sustain and build life. You know, it's this agricultural image that creates communities and creates life around it. I love that picture of taking something and transforming it into something that represents peace and community and people living together in love and justice. He moves on and he goes into this picture of every person living under their own vine and fig tree. You know, again, I think this is indicative of a vision of peace that also is related to the creation itself, right? We're living in harmony with the creation, enjoying God's creation, taking care of God's creation, and this vision of peace there. You know, I imagine sitting under a tree in the sun, and it just is peaceful. And also, you know, if you're a Hamilton fan, a little bit of background to Hamilton, that's where, you know, George Washington gets his line about this. Yeah, for whatever that's worth. But I love that quintessential picture of this something being, something that was meant for violence turned into something for peace. And then that statement, and no one will make them afraid. No one will make them afraid. Everyone is living in peace because they have learned the ways of God, because they've met God and He's arbitrated between the peoples so that we can have peace restored, even down to us and the very creation itself. And this is the picture that Micah sets out about a peaceful global future in the kingdom of God. And I don't know about you, but when I think about this, when I reflect on this picture, I just find it so compelling. And I think that, that's what we want to spend the rest of our time this morning talking about is, there's all of these competing visions of what peace looks like and how to get to peace. And I think as people of faith, this is one that we need to think deeply about and really live into so that we can truly have a peaceful future. So one of the key things that you notice about this picture of peace is that it begins with the people going up, meeting God, and learning about His ways. And so, before we talk a little bit about some of the ways that Jesus taught us to live and, seek out peace, I wanted to kind of mention a few things because I think a lot of us can feel some disillusionment with things like this. I think we've been taught or been told here so often in our world this idea that, well, people just need Jesus and that'll fix all of their problems. And I think truthfully, this has been used in a dishonest way. It's been used in a way that, when someone is seeking justice, they're told, you just need Jesus and that'll fix it, even though that person has no desire to actually fix the injustice that's going on. There's a fundamental dishonesty to that. For example, when we're talking about racism, in our country, you had times where there were tons of Christians and yet white people were enslaving black people. There's a fundamental contradiction there. And I just want to make clear as we begin talking about this is I think that it's important to say that's exactly not what we're talking about. We're not talking about having the name of Christian or just worshiping Jesus in some abstract sense will automatically lead to peace. But I think in this text what we see is that It's the going up to God and learning His ways. It's practicing His practices. It's learning from Him to be loving, to be just, the things that create true lasting peace. Something that Martin Luther King said is, if we want true peace, we must work for and align ourselves with justice. If a person is not committed to working for and aligning with justice, their cries for peace are insincere and are only maintaining order while inhumanity persists. That's not at all what we're talking about. But the same man said, hate is too heavy a burden to bear. And I think this is really where we have to push for the Christian vision for peace, which is that we have no part in injustice, and we will not ever seek peace in a way that dismisses people, the injustice and the inhumanity that people are experiencing. The very opposite. To have lasting peace, we must address those things. But at the same time, we are not any means necessary type of people. Hate is too heavy of a burden to bear. And that's the part where this Christian vision of peace, this vision that Micah sets out, is important in our world with all kinds of competing visions, is that we are people of love. And to get to a peaceful future, we have to learn the ways of Jesus. We have to learn from Jesus. How do we create peace in our world that lasts? And I think there's a lot of people, both people who call themselves Christians and people that don't, that struggle with this. I was reading, it was a really interesting section of a book. It's called Stamped from the Beginning by X. Ibram Kendi. And he was talking about how a lot of the people who were, he was specifically talking about people who were in the Black Panther movement, didn't understand some of the power of the nonviolent movement that Martin Luther King was, that he was leading. And it was really interesting because he talked about how they were kind of perplexed at first when Martin Luther King was killed. They were kind of surprised because they just thought about him as, he's Martin Luther King, he's always talking about love, he's not that dangerous. I think this is one of the things that we're talking about today, is that I think they didn't realize how dangerous nonviolence and Christian peace is. It's deeply dangerous. It breaks apart what we think about peace and justice in our world. It calls into question the very order of the way the world works. This is what we're going to be looking at the end. Is, one of the things that we talked about, one of the things that we talked about in my counseling degree was this difference between first order changes and second order changes. And I think this is what nonviolent, peaceful protest, peaceful direct action, peaceful even in our interpersonal relationships, what it does is that rather than having a first order change where, you can have people who want to use violence to right injustices. This is a first order change. But what we're talking about is a second order change. It changes the actual rules by which we play. And violence has been a part of our story from the beginning. I think it's telling that, in the book of Genesis, you get one page through the Bible and you've got Cain killing Abel. I think that's telling about who we are as humans. You see the same thing in our national history with just the stories that we tell ourselves. There's a certain glow around the founding fathers and things like that, the violence that took place, even in our, enshrined in our Constitution or things like that. And I think this is where, as Christians, we push ourselves, and Jesus pushes us to make that second order change into nonviolent peace that is the only thing that can create lasting peace, rather than these first order changes that may change some things for good, but may leave other things unaddressed. We're trying to be a part of this movement of God that is creating justice in every single case, that is leading to a place where all things are set right. Again, between us and God, us and other people, even us and the very creation itself. So I wanted to draw out a couple of principles that I see in the life and teaching of Jesus. And again, I mean, I think this is appropriate to Micah in that when he talks about in the latter days, this is talking about the coming of the Lord, that when Jesus comes to earth and creates his church and his kingdom on earth, that's us going up to the mountain to learn his ways. And so there's a couple of things that I wanted to bring out that we view, that we see and learn in his life. And one of them is that Jesus gives us a different view on how to interact and wield power. So since the beginning, the literal beginning, the sword has represented people who have power, people who wield power. You see nations, even nations that are seeking peace. For example, you think about the Roman nation or the Roman Empire who talked about the Roman peace. But this was a peace brought about by the sword. They would take over other areas, and that was the Roman peace. It had to come through violence. You see this, again in our own nation, where perhaps there was a just cause of, revolting from the British nation, but then also that led to other injustices that happened through the sword. And these are, again, those first order changes that don't lead to full peace or freedom. And in Jesus, we find a different way to interact with power. A way that powerful people are taught to instead wield their power with love and forgiveness. You have the most powerful being in the entire world coming in to our world, becoming like us, and subjecting himself to suffering and ultimately death. And even in those moments of being betrayed, even in those moments of being crucified, you see him loving the people around him. You see him forgiving the people around him. And this is the way that Jesus teaches us to wield our power. This is something that Martin Luther King called nonviolence is the sword that heals. It's that, I think it's similar to that image from Micah. It's the sword that's transformed into something that's healing. That's what nonviolence, peace, and love does. Is it transforms the whole process, is the only thing that can lead to lasting peace. And so when Jesus teaches us to do that, not only does it transform nations, like the picture in Micah, where we're looking towards a global future where there will be no more war, but it goes all the way down to our interpersonal relationships, where, I personally don't have the power to create a war, probably, but I do have the power to treat you right. I do have the power to, if I wanted to, I could create harm on Holly and vice versa. I could create harm within the context of missio or sojourn. You could create harm or create peace in your relationships at work, in your family. As a church, as we're seeking to create peace and justice in our world, we have the ability to go about that in ways that reflect Jesus' teachings on power and his upside down kingdom, where the powerful serve rather than they are being served. Or we can do that in unhealthy ways, or we can do that in healthy ways. And so Jesus transforms the way that we interact as his followers with power and how we wield it for love and justice and peace. The second thing is, I think in the life of Jesus, you see a willingness to go first. I think this is really critical when we're talking about peace and nonviolence, is that the idea of nonviolence does no good if we're not willing to go first. If we have the attitude of, I'll go when they go, that's the very thing that's been happening since the beginning. And I think nonviolence is a way of stopping the arms race. You know, you see this both on a national scale and in our interpersonal relationships, where if one party does something, the other party responds with something greater. And so, you know, the classic example is the Cold War, where you've got, you know, the United States and Russia. Nobody is fighting, but there's an arms race for, you know, they may do this, so we do this. They may do that, and so we'll do that. We do this in our interpersonal relationships too, where there's all of these, you know, communication errors, or true, you know, somebody does something that hurts us, so we have the decision of whether we're going to hurt them back or not. And I think that's the real beauty of Jesus' teaching about turning the other cheek. I think it's the real beauty of the teaching about loving our enemies, is that it stops the cycle. It stops the cycle of violence and hate and injustice that we all experience in the world. And so as people of faith, as followers of Jesus, we have the opportunity to instead respond in a way that says, I'm not only going to not stoop to your level, but I'm also not going to let you stoop to your own level. I'm not, you know, and this is a key thing, is that, you know, nonviolence, this loving, peaceful action, is anything but inaction or apathy. It's very strategic. It's very powerful in that way. And like we talked about a minute ago, very dangerous because of that, because it unravels the game that we've been playing. I think that's what Jesus teaches us to do, is that we fight injustice. We fight evil and hate with love. We fight it with nonviolence. We fight it with peace. And I think what's so powerful about that is it creates a vision that is positive going forward and that all people can join in. That we're going to right every injustice, not just this one or not just that one. And we're not willing to play any part in evil. We would rather be hurt ourselves than play any part in evil. And I think in that there's so much power, because all of us can come together and create this world that Jesus is trying to create, where things are set right, where every person gets to, you know, metaphorically sit under their own vine and their own fig tree, where swords are beat into plowshares, where all of us are living in peace and harmony. As we finish up today, I just want to encourage us as a church that even though we see these deep divisions, deep injustice in our world, we have a part to play. We can join in all kinds of justice issues, people, and especially with people who are not people of faith. And yet in the midst of that, we can also join in with this vision that's even greater, this vision that's even bigger than the visions of peace and justice that we see in our world. I think that's powerful. And I think it all, again, begins with learning from Jesus, learning how to have peace, how to love one another, how to create a just society. And so that's my encouragement for this Sunday, and that's also my prayer for our world. And, especially again, as the elections are coming up, this is our prayer that God would be creating this peaceful, just world that we can participate in. And also, we can enjoy. We can enjoy it as He brings it into existence.